doctrine that emerged in America during the 1900s. Raise your hand. Manifest destiny. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about manifest destiny. It emerged in our nation at the beginning, really formalized in 1845. But this was the doctrine of some within our own country who believed that our nation's destiny was to progressively advance liberty and the development of the land as they went westward. In that sense, they saw that, in one sense, God's destiny for our nation is to be manifest as we progressively move this view of liberty and the good of man by advancing it westward. So this was, in one sense, this very high-level motive that worked out in claiming the lands that were westward of our nation's states in the late 18th century. It opened the doors for a new wave of immigrants to come to our country from Europe, but it opened the door for settlers who did have a demand for land, that they would own land, that they could therefore move westward, possess land, and be protected by the rights that the United States granted them. These lands to the west of the states were vast. They were relatively underdeveloped by human civilization, but they were not uninhabited. They were inhabited by Native Americans, as well as descendants of Spanish settlers who had intermarried with the Native American people of Mexico. And where those folks were, especially the descendants from the Spanish and French settlers to the north, as well as certain parts of the Gulf, those settlements, though far less developed than what was taking place in the United States, they had communities that were dominated by Roman Catholicism. So when you think about westward expansion, when you think about what is this manifest destiny of the United States moving west to manifest this progression of liberty, you're going to have a collision with people who have a totally different origin story than those who made up the United States. A different religion, the Roman Catholic, and they also have a different sort of native of origin, Spain and France. But settlers moved west, and they were Protestants, generally speaking. By that, now I'm not using that designation to mean that they are born-again Christians, though many of them were, but they clearly identified themselves as they would be Protestant in contrast to Roman Catholic. So manifest destiny was, in one sense, it was taking a self-understanding of what the United States of America was and projected itself on these new lands through the settlers who were going westward, but it also was distinctly Protestant. And so as they moved west and interacted with Catholics from Spanish or French descendants, you saw that there was a mix of religious, political, and ethnic distinctions. And those who were the settlers from America moving westward, they thought in every way they were superior to the settlements that they encountered. Manifest destiny was President Monroe's doctrine that the European settlements and settlers, that they were going to take North America from east to west to really develop what God had destined this nation to become. So America had at least some, and it was a dominant and popular doctrine. It saw itself as having claim to all of the land west, all the way to the Pacific, despite the fact that it was occupied by other people, in part because they did view their religion, they viewed their political ideology to be superior. Just to be quite clear, I view The United States of America, our Constitution, the formation in one sense of the state, which is a constitutional republic, I view it as superior to all other present versions of government. I'm not unaware of that. I would almost advocate for you to do the same thing, despite what your, particular political philosophy is. So I don't think that is necessarily something that we should intrinsically judge to be arrogant. If you come to an understanding of a constitutional republic to be the greatest government possible on earth before the theocratic kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ, then you should view it as superior to other views. Likewise, I view Protestant Reformed Christianity to be true Christianity. I view it to be biblical Christianity, and therefore I rightfully judge it to be superior to all other versions. So in that way, I think on one hand, it is clearly, especially what's going on in our day and age, that there is this attempt that really has been happening for decades to say that Western civilization, and especially, any kind of American or colonial civilization, it is fundamentally sinful. We need to think very critically before we yield those kinds of designations to categories of government or a political science view or a particular doctrinal understanding of biblical religion just because it is unpopular with historians and so-called, the academic guild that may have a few more degrees behind their name than we do. But this is a particular time period that people are enjoying crucifying in our the present historical studies that are being done in universities. It is, however, true that we have a less than stellar moral record when it comes to the way in which they behaved as they went westward. As the settlers were going westward and they were laying claims to land that had already been inhabited by other people, it's not a noble tale. Texas is at this time a part of Mexico. Does anybody know Texas history? Right, so I've enjoyed learning in part Texas history. It isn't exactly as noble as I thought it was, but Texas was a part of Mexico. And as settlers from the east were moving into Texas, they were settling in a particular land that was under Mexico's sovereign rule. But the white, American immigrants to Texas moved there, agreeing with the Mexican government, their particular leader, Santa Anna, that they would become Roman Catholic. So they yielded, in one sense, an allegiance to Protestantism to become a Roman Catholic so that they could own land in the area that we now call Texas. These immigrants eventually they came to own land in great number and had significant influence over time. And they eventually, this group in Texas, they seceded from Mexico. And so when we think about the Alamo and you're thinking about Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin and Davy Crockett died in the Alamo, like that particular military struggle was not for the United States of America, it was for the sovereign state of Texas. And so that's how Texas won its independence from the Mexican president. Santa Anna is in the battle against Mexico for the Republic of Texas. Pardon? Yeah. Yeah, correct. But in one sense, when we just think of, remember the Alamo, but that was the initial struggle in one sense that kind of is the icon of that military struggle that ultimately won victory for the sovereign nation state of Texas, the Republic of Texas. Mexico agreed that Texas would remain its independent nation on this condition that if it would not be annexed by the United States. Texas agreed to this condition in the treaty that they signed, but when President James Polk was elected president, Congress voted for Texas to enter the Union in 1844. America sent troops into Mexico to provoke a war and eventually got it. Congress then was able to declare war on Mexico, and a brief war between America and Mexico followed, which Mexico lost, signed the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hildolfo in 1848, and gave over to the United States $15 million in the areas that we now call the states of New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Nevada, and part of Colorado. The Mexican descendants who were in the state of Texas now, that was annexed by the United States, now declared to be a state, they were promised that they would get the same rights as the European descendants who had already settled in Texas. That was granted to them in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hildolfo. However, as more settlers from the east moved into Texas, the rights of these Mexican Texans were violated. Now, all of this is a story for us to be able to understand, in one sense, the non-Christian distinctives of manifest destiny as it's being applied in political environments. So by saying we are Christians, looking at the history of the church in America, we are not having any kind of uncritical evaluation of the acts of our nation in history. This clearly seems to be deceitful. There's quite a number of examples we're going to come to in our nation's history that I think is deceitful. So this is how Texas becomes a state, and this is how the lands that really dominate the western part of our nation, especially the central and southwest, how they come into the domain of the United States of America's rule. Churches on the issue of manifest destiny were divided. When churches and their leaders were making comments about what do they think about the war with Mexico, they did not agree, at least before 1848. The churchmen, at least some of the churchmen, saw these actions as what I think that they really are, and that is they were raw acts of aggression fueled by a desire for more land. And so churches in America were able, at least their leaders were able to say, this is my judgment of what our nation is doing. As they saw land being grabbed by our nation moving west, they also, at least some of them, judged it to be the arm that was going to create more slave territories or slave states. And so churches and their leaders protested, at least in part, not in whole. But this is going to be a trend. What happens when Protestants and their churches now head west? What do you think is going to change about the opinion of these particular lands and how they came into our nation? So when they're happening, there can be, hey, this just seems like a raw act of aggression, which is fundamentally opposed to supposedly the way in which we're going to conduct ourselves as a nation. But then when your relatives go there and you realize, hey, there's a Baptist church planted in Houston, and you're able to see things happening, do you think things are going to change when it comes to an evaluation of the legitimacy and the good of moving westward? That's right. Yeah, they do. So as the settlers moved west, as Protestants moved west, as churches were able to be established as they moved west, this was accepted as beneficial. Right? So that's the way in which it comes, at least in the minds of the churches, it comes to be accepted. I think in part this is just what happens with providence. that you're able to see things that take place and rightly judge that this is a violation of what God declares to be good and right, and therefore we oppose it. But God orders things, and then you are to be faithful with what God has rendered to you. So I don't necessarily have a real ethical conundrum about that. That's just the story of what was taking place as manifest destiny, as a doctrine of our nation, was bringing more lands, at least through questionable acts, but yet real Christians and churches were established there. Many churches saw this as God's way of opening a door for the gospel to go to the Mexican peoples. It also saw an increase, this is very unique, an increase of the number of Roman Catholics in the United States. Now, but this is different. You may remember that there was really only one Roman Catholic colony. What was that? Maryland, right? Makes sense. All right. So Maryland is the Catholic colony. And in that way, that really is the only place that Catholicism has any kind of respected position. I went to our own state capital and was listening to a lecture there with Bo when he was, like 6th grade. And the first 3 North Carolina Supreme Court justices, one of them was a Roman Catholic. But it was against the law for a Roman Catholic to be buried within the city limits of Raleigh. So when he died, they had to take his body, this is on a buggy drawn by courts, outside the city limits and bury him so that he was from the western part of the state, so that then his family could come and then remove his remains and bury them where he was from. It was that kind of opposition to Roman Catholicism that permeated quite a bit of the colonies. So you never really saw, apart from when we are taking territories that had been developed by the French and or not developed, but they had been in one sense discovered and partly developed by the Spanish and the French, we will see Roman Catholic numbers increase or certain waves of immigration. And this is really going to be from the period of westward expansion through the immigration that follows prior to World War I. And then you'll see another wave of it later. The distinction, and this is helpful for us to be able at least to see that some of the criticisms that will come to Protestant Christianity in the history of our nation is not unique to Protestant Christianity. When westward expansion took place, and at the end of the Mexican-American War, when we received all of this land and therefore all of its inhabitants who were Roman Catholic, again, they did not come from the English Roman Catholic tradition. They came from the Spanish or French Roman Catholic tradition. And so they weren't, in one sense, like the Roman Catholicism of America. And there was quite a bit of differences between the Roman Catholic peoples of the Westward territories and the Roman Catholic leadership that was centered on the East Coast. And so what took place is the Roman Catholic Church was very ineffective to be able to bring together the Roman Catholics in the westward territories and the leadership in the East. They sent bishops to have the positions of authority in these new western territories from eastern locations. Obviously, Baltimore would be one of these locations. But they were American, and they sought to Americanize these Spanish, Mexican, French descendants who were Roman Catholics in the West. And they removed all of the Hispanic priests. There was a big difference. I read about that the way in which the Hispanic priesthood related to the people of the West, the villages, is they were very much committed to the poor and caring for the people. In one sense, we could say they had much more of a shepherd's approach to their ministry. But the Americanized Roman Catholic priests were very different. They were almost more like tax barons. And so, on one hand, I just think as studying church history in our country, and as most of it is Protestant Christianity in some form or fashion, it's easy for people to sort of level the criticisms and say that's intrinsic to Protestant Christianity, when in fact it's really intrinsic to people. And so one of these illustrations is what takes place with Catholicism as westward expansion takes place, and we, in one sense, take over all these Catholics in the Western territories. Well, that's the brief introduction to Manifest Destiny and the Western expansion. There's a whole lot of horror stories that we could tell, and there's some heroic stories, but that is the period that, in one sense, if you're interested in the history of the American West, that's the apex, that's the epicenter of what created the American West. So I think that's also, if you wanted to study further, when you study the history of the church and the society of the East Coast and the way the church and the society of the West Coast, how they are different, you really need to get into how immigration and expansion are very different between the two areas. So having lived on the West Coast, I'm able to say, yeah, you can see the difference when you live there as someone who was born and raised here in the Southeast. All right, so that's westward expansion, manifest destiny. Any questions? There's a whole lot of taking land from the Native Americans. I didn't get into any of the stories, Donnie, but this is the time period. Manifest destiny is this larger doctrine that is governing the political decisions of our nation to take the lands westward. So there's a lot of horror stories of how that takes place, but there's also there's stories of real Christian people acting like real Christians as they're moving west. I don't have stories that are planned for us. The other side of it is, I think we have to be careful when you look into history that you want to make sure that I guess we would say, if our history is the American citizens who are moving west, we think they're the good guys. Some of them, not all of them. But likewise, if you think like the story that you want to really get behind is the story of the Native Americans, as if, okay, they're the good guys. No, that wouldn't be accurate either. So when you're looking into it, Donnie, you're going to see that it's like all of history. Your good guys are not all that good, and your bad guys are maybe not all as bad as you think they are. And so there's a lot of we have to have some distinctions as we just look and see what happened. So Native American people are pagan people. So they acted like pagan people. And at the same time, the motives and ambitions of a good bit of the people who were moving westward, they were not godly people either. And so what do you find? People acting like sinners. So it's our history. It's just not, it's a history of sinners. But I didn't get into it, Donnie, because in one sense it's significant, but it's a broad, wild world that has so few people entering into it. And so the history of the church isn't very much shaped by these particular stories. But what is significant is we see the view of this nation in which the church does exist within. And so I bring up issues of our nation and then say, how is the church thinking about this? How is the church thinking about manifest destiny? How is the church thinking about westward expansion? And so in that way, I'm wanting us to look at the history of the church as it is unfolding in the midst of the history of our nation. So westward expansion and manifest destiny, in particular the war with Mexico, which gave us these western territories, that is the bigger issue that we can learn from. The next is slavery. Slavery was introduced to the United States when it was colonies of the British Empire. The War of Independence against Britain granted to, in one sense, this nation to be a nation that was made up, at least in part, of slave-owning citizens from the beginning. It wasn't a decision. When you think of slavery in the United States of America, it was never a decision that the United States of America made. They inherited this understanding of society when they won the war for independence. However, when independence was won, there were Americans who were raising the question, should slavery, the legal right to own another human being, should that be a mark of this new nation which is distinctively committed to the freedom of its citizens? So while it was inherited, there were individuals that saw this as a question that needed to be raised. However, what would you imagine if you just gathered your family together, which obviously, as all families, you have your disagreements, you've got your past, bickerings to deal with, but for a particular skirmish you had with another clan, you came together, you won the skirmish. What would you want to project to this enemy? Weakness or strength? Unity or division? Unity. So at least at some level, because unity and strength was a necessity for this brand new, somewhat fledgling nation, the leaders decided that the question of slavery was not going to be addressed at the birth of our nation. So I think there was a number of reasons that led to this being pushed aside and not being addressed at the beginning of our nation. The demand was clearly agreed upon by the whole that our country needs to be as united as it can and as undivided as possible. So slavery was ushered into the United States of America without much of a struggle. A number of churches at the beginning, after the War of Independence, so at the beginning of our nation's history, there were a number of churches that opposed slavery, and they opposed slave ownership. Quakers aren't Orthodox Christians, but in the history of our country, Quakers are the group that does hold the most consistently to the opposition to slavery and slave ownership. In 1776, Quakers expelled slave owners from their membership, as well as those who advocated for slave ownership. In 1784, American Methodists, which is a subgroup when you think of the Methodist movement within Anglicanism, they banned the slave ownership from its members. Baptists, so again, this is late 18th century. Baptists also, they opposed slavery. Now, Baptists, by nature of their view of church government, how would you do that as a Baptist? Congregation by congregation. So you don't have like this, grand sort of presbytery or a cardinal, but individual Baptist churches opposed slave ownership for its members in the beginning. But these Protestant churches, the Methodists, the Baptists, they did not hold fast to this first impulse of the evil of chattel slavery, but the Quakers did. By the mid-19th century, Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians were not significantly different on their views of slavery from the rest of American society. In the South, slavery was a foundation to the societal order due to its intrinsic need for the economy in the South, which was agrarian, to function. Methodists and Baptists were ministering to these individuals who owned slaves, and at least in part to be able to minister to and potentially draw slave-owning individuals, they moderated their original views on slavery and became more attracted to those who owned slaves. By 1843, over 1,000 Methodist ministers and preachers owned slaves. In 1818, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, that would be over all of America, they declared slavery to be against God's law, but opposed abolition and even deposed a member who advocated for abolition. And I'm giving you this information on one hand so that we can accurately understand our nation's disposition and struggle with slavery, not to necessarily be the way in which it often is sort of spun. Right? That there were questions, there was original opposition, but just like we saw with westward expansion, while there's initial questions about the morality of these, as things become to be the dominant accepted practice in society, the church tends to come off of a hard stand. In one sense, they lack the teeth that they initially had. And that is true when it comes to the Methodists and the Baptists on the issue of slavery. In the early 19th century, so this is the 1800s, slavery in the northern states was not a foundation to their economy, but their views on slavery were no different than the southern states. The abolitionist movement, however, did emerge in the northern states in the mid-19th century and gained much more support there. There are, I think, reasons in society that we should expect for abolition causes and efforts to take faster traction in the northern states as opposed to the southern states. Again, the South has existed for quite a long time upon its agrarian foundation of the economy that was dependent upon slave labor. And so they understood that if you're going to call into question the place of slavery, you're calling into question not a piece, but the whole fabric of the way of living of the southern states. And so it's easier for you to embrace something like abolition when you're in the North, and it isn't an intrinsic fiber to the fabric of your economy and your society. And then to expect for those people who do see this, like, you can't change just this changes the whole, for them to be slower and to see it as something more of a revolutionary idea as opposed to something of a good reform. And so we see this distinction emerging in the middle of the 19th century. This is something that's going to be a trend. A number of the theological institutions in the North, the colleges, the churches in the North, there is a theological downgrade that is taking place at the same time. So we rightly remember that New England was founded by what group of religious immigrants? Puritans. It is in New England that we find Unitarianism coming to sort of, in one sense, kill the Puritan Congregationalists. That's what Edwards was. This idea of Unitarianism is that sort of the atoning work of God is for all people. Likewise, we're seeing emerge in this place not only the sort of the cemetery of those who have fallen to Unitarianism from the Puritan Congregationalists, you're also able to see that other anti-biblical ideologies creep into the Presbyterian seminaries of the North, such that Darwinianism is being entertained, that there's these questions now that are fundamentally opposed to the Christian faith based upon Scripture that are being accepted, or at least beginning to take root in northern institutions, but not in southern institutions. So again, The southern states have slavery as a fabric of its society, but they also have, in one sense, a more devoted to Orthodox Christian doctrine. The northern states, which do have, in one sense, they're quicker to take hold of abolition, but they also are taking hold of clearly anti-Christian ideologies. Right? That kind of distinction makes it very difficult for Christians to think, if you're advocating this and you're holding to that somehow you're on the right side. This is going to clearly create differences between not only southern states just in a political position, but also for Christians and churches and pastors in the southern churches in contrast to the northern churches. Numerous pastors, therefore, in the South began to take up the cause of slavery and to defend Southern slavery from their pulpits. Likewise, numerous pastors began to take up the cause of abolition with their pulpits. And so you begin to see before the Civil War that the division has already begun to take root and sort of to set the lines to be indeed political, economic, moral, and religious. The Methodist Church dramatically split at this time. In 1844, the Methodist General Conference condemned Georgia's bishop because he was a slave owner. So you remember, Methodist form of government is an Episcopal form of government, all right? So it's the same form of government as the Anglican Church, which is very much the same form of government as the Catholic Church, with just having the Crown of England being the head instead of the Pope. So the Georgia bishop is condemned by the governing body, the Methodist General Conference, in 1844 on the grounds of owning slave ownership. Now again, what was the view towards slaves of the North and South at the beginning of the 19th century? It's the same view, right? That's pretty fast. Like if you're thinking 50 years for these things to take place, I mean, that's just in one half of somebody's life. All right. So another thing I think we learn about history, people do not like for things to change, and they really do not like for things to change quickly. So this is relatively fast change. It's also at this time that a Baptist missionary agency refuses to commission a candidate from the Georgia Baptist Convention. The Georgia Baptist Convention, they approved this particular candidate to the mission agency. The reason that the mission agency did not commend him or commission him is because he owned slaves. This was what ultimately brought about the division between the Baptists that gave birth to the Southern Baptist Convention. So in 1861, you may know that that's also the beginning of the war between the states, or the Civil War. The presbyteries in the South withdrew from the Presbyterian Church. They then founded another Presbyterian church, the Southern Presbyterian Church, right? So what do we see? The mainline Protestant churches at this time are the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and the Episcopalians. 3 out of 4 of the mainline churches split over the issue of slavery. Only the Episcopalians did not experience a schism in a formal fashion in its church. Likewise, Roman Catholics evaded schism. In part is because the relatively insignificant position Roman Catholics had in our country at that time. The Civil War also took the place of pulpits. Kevin.
Separation of the Anglicans from the Episcopalians have led into them
I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. I don't know. Robert E. Lee was an Episcopalian. Most of the Virginia, kind of the planting, gentleman class of Virginia were Episcopalians. So it seems curious to me when I read that, but I don't know much of the details or really any of all about the inner workings of the Episcopalian Church on this particular issue. But the church itself didn't split. Pulpits were, in one sense, commandeered for the respective causes in the southern states and the northern states. Northern states' pulpits were preaching about the moral Christian high ground of the northern cause in the Civil War, and likewise, pulpits in churches in the South were taking up the cause of the Confederacy. The military consequences that really came from the war being conducted in the South, in addition to the methods employed during Reconstruction after the Civil War, and the humiliation of the Confederate States to be an economic colony of the North that had an enforced military occupation, deepened the bitterness of the difference between the southern states and the northern states. Likewise, it continued to deepen the differences between churches in the South and churches in the North. The North was greatly hated by the South, and after the war, not a few Southern churches used their pulpits to take up the causes for continued opposition to the North. Pulpits in churches in the South even supported the Ku Klux Klan, which emerged during this time. Churches in the South preached for ongoing racial segregation and fostered values that were shaped to oppose just the North's way. I want to bring this up because when you find churches being entrenched in a battle, one of the lessons that we learn from history is that churches can often lose sight of God's word because they are only focused on the perceived enemy. This is going to come up when we look at fundamentalism and what took place in the beginning of the 20th century. And we see it here. Now, we're in no way trying to defend what the Southern churches were doing with their pulpits and what they were preaching, but I think it comes out of the fact that American slavery, when you look at it as an institution, was based off of stealing people. Africans in Africa stole individuals in war. They raided them, they captured them, and then they sold them to Europeans who then traded them as slaves, right? This had been taking place, and this really is the history of the world. Slavery is intrinsic with human beings. And so this is, in one sense, you do see slavery in America because of its origins from the British colonies. It is based upon human trafficking, stealing human beings. And God's word prohibits that. That's why slavery in Israel was never based upon stealing someone. You could give yourself to be enslaved for a period of time, which was a method that, in one sense, preserved that the land would continue to be passed down through the generations. It was, in one sense, a dramatic action that you took to be able to provide for your family. American slavery is not based upon that form of slavery. It was based upon the act of sin of human stealing. If there is sin, what is the only way that sin can be dealt with such that there can be peace between individuals? If I sin against John, how is it that John and I can be reconciled and have peace with one another? that there has to be a reconciliation that's centered in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And if there is the ability for restitution to take place, then restitution is given. I would just present to us the problems that emerge from Reconstruction and really continue on are in part because we didn't deal with things God's way. Emancipation Proclamation is not God's way of being able to deal with something that has sinful components to it. And so in this way, what I think we see in part is that governments, just like families, any sort of group of human beings are looking at a particular problem and we're wanting to figure out how might we deal with this problem, and if that problem includes sin, is there a way that we can deal with this that's going to lead to peace between warring members that isn't going to deal with sin God's way? There's not. And so in one sense, Reconstruction did not do anything to be able to bring peace between these, two warring divisions within the United States of America. Therefore, the problem continues. A war was fought, blood was spilt, and there is no peace. And so this is now, in one sense, a problem that is failing to be addressed in God's way. There were individuals, and we're not going to get into all of this, but there were individuals who were able to see, and this is of Southern slave-owning individuals, whether they owned slaves personally or they were part of states or churches that allowed for Christians to own slaves, they were able to see that God's way would deal with this in a certain way. If you want to read about this, I can recommend to you, Douglas Wilson has a book called Black and Tan. If anybody ever wants me to cancel me, you can clearly do it now, because if I recommend this book, he's been tarred and feathered as a neo-Confederate for the manner in which he seeks to articulate, from a biblical perspective, how do we assess these difficult situations that slavery in America presents to us. And I would suggest that book actually is an accurate approach to trying to take what does the Bible say, such that we could be able to parse out what should we judge about these past sins and the manner in these individuals. And I think there was a better way, and our nation didn't take that better way. And so the problems that emerged in the churches and between blacks and whites in America, between the North and the South, in part is only the illustration of we did not take God's way. This bitterness and sin continues in the South, and it now becomes manifest when Reconstruction ends. And so the forced political restrictions that were placed upon the Confederate states, the Southern states, by the federal government, when they pull those back, what do you think you're going to get? When you have enforced people to do what you demand them to do by military occupation and economic rule, what do you think is going to happen when you remove those restrictions? They're going to do what they want to do, right? This is what happens with our children. When our children are removed from our homes, when they're 18 or whatever it is, all right, and we may, as we should, as fathers, say, these are the rules of my home. This is what is required for you to live and be at peace with all members of my family. Well, when they get freedom and they no longer have you restraining them, what do you think they're going to do? What they've been wanting to do the whole time. And so when Reconstruction ends and the forced restrictions of the federal government are removed from the southern states, they now politically establish racial segregation with the Jim Crow laws, which illustrates, did the Civil War do anything to really deal with root problems? I don't think it did. Pardon? So the Supreme Court now is brought to the issue of the segregation that's being legislated in the southern states, and they support segregation if it is equal. Churches also reflect these same views at the time. Before the Civil War, black slaves would attend churches that consisted of white Christians. After Reconstruction, those churches now banned blacks from coming to their churches. And this gave rise to denominations of churches, or so-called black churches, such as the National Baptist Convention, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, this was not the first time that churches emerged, denominations emerged that were distinctively black denominations. Before the Civil War, the African Methodist Episcopal Church emerged. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church had already begun. The latter, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, AME Zion, it emerged due to the racist policies of those in the North American Methodist Church, that they didn't want a black man to be ordained to certain positions and placed in a certain place, namely in Philadelphia. And so that gave rise to this new black denomination of Methodism, right? So what I'm wanting us to see is that the problem, in one sense, only deepens. The segregation, the racial segregation between blacks and white Christians in our country only becomes more distinct at the end of Reconstruction. From this point forward, and this is significant for understanding the role of the church in the African American community in our country, it's from this point forward after Reconstruction that the central hub to the black community is the church. And the leaders within the black community are most often pastors. It's after Reconstruction that the black church and the leaders, the pastors in the black church, now have to deal with the tension of being Christian and being committed to what the Bible teaches, and then also having to struggle for justice for blacks in America. Right? So in that sense, if you may read about Martin Luther King Jr., and you may read some of his, his father was a pastor before he was a pastor, and he was a pastor before he was a civil rights leader. And you may, in one sense, read some of the things that he says. And obviously, he was a very powerful orator and a highly intelligent man. But then you might also find out that he was an adulterer. And this kind of tension, all right, if you want to read more, you can read the Bidi Anyabwile's, the decline of African-American theology. This, in one sense, is a consequence of what did emerge after Reconstruction. But there's also something that's taken place, and that's the downgrade in the northern churches and the continued distrust in the Southern church. As I've mentioned, Unitarianism, Darwinism, and the beginning encroachment of Protestant liberalism is changing the theological fidelity of the seminaries, churches, denominations in the North through the 19th century. The churches in the North eventually were tragically affected by these anti-Christian philosophies. In addition to this downgrade of Protestant Christianity in the northern states, there's a new wave of immigration that consists largely of people other than Protestants. A large number of them are Roman Catholics. But add to that, there's a rapid population growth among the cities that puts incredible social strain upon the urban societies. Again, that entry point into our nation is the North. And so the North is really going through a very dramatic change, and a consequence is the Protestant Christians in the North have a significant compromise to the fidelity of the truth of God's word, while In the post-Reconstruction South churches, they are doubling down their commitment to their way of life. They are distancing themselves from the Northern church institutions. Now, many historians claim that this was only an anti-intellectualism and a commitment to racist views. It clearly is, at least in part, an anti-intellectualism and a commitment to racist views. I just don't think it is in whole. The reason is because intellectualism is what the northern churches and seminaries were advocating they were doing as they were bringing on Darwinianism and modernism. So that discerning voices in the southern churches are able to see that for what it is. It's not anti-intellectualism, it's just anti-Christian. But at some level, there is an anti-intellectualism that happens. Theologically, the Protestant theology of the Reformation is being ruined by non-Christian philosophies in the northern-based college and seminaries, which are the oldest seminaries and colleges in the nation's history. And so the South is opposing these downgrades while insulating themselves from them. There's a skepticism about what the intellectual guild is doing in the northern churches and educational institutions, and greater distrust and divide is being created in the southern churches, right? Again, I think here's another lesson. One of the things that happens when there's a controversy, I think this is very relevant to what's going on right now in the so-called evangelical Protestant Reformed Church in our own country, with our challenges on critical race theory and intersectionality, these challenges on the views of American government, even like what your opinion is of President Trump, right? One of the things that we can take away from church history and this particular part of church history is that if we just try to insulate ourselves to those who think like us, and we do not engage with the arguments of those who may oppose our positions, then we're not actually going to clarify what is our point of difference. I heard this one man, Victor Davis Hanson, he described just what's happening in our country right now as an intellectual monastery. All right, we're becoming intellectual monastics. That we're able to go and get information from only those places that we want to get information. That's true of me. And so 5 years ago, I'd regularly listen to NPR. No longer is that the case. And likewise, I doubt anybody who's listening to NPR is probably getting news from the same sources that I'm getting news from. All right, we've sort of gone into our enclaves that separate us from these other people in the world. What we need to be careful is, I'm not interested in false ideologies. But if we're going to be able to communicate our difference, we actually have to communicate what is our point of difference. And I think one of the things that took place is that was not effectively happening. Not only did that not happen prior to the Civil War, it didn't happen after the Civil War. It didn't happen after Reconstruction. Now this comes to a strange head because you have the Industrial Revolution to take place at the turn of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And this brings into the cities a great deal of potential work, which brings people from the rural sections of our country, especially into the cities in the north. In addition to these people immigrating from rural to the city, you also have immigrants from other parts of Europe coming in with different religious, namely Roman Catholic positions. And so there's a flood into the cities, but the structure is not there. So they live, in one sense, with dire conditions. They're disconnected from their families. They used to live in a like if you consider rural life demands that you have relationships with your neighbors. Now, you might do it not as regularly as living in a city, but just to survive, you typically have to depend on one another. Likewise, like people are aware of what's going on with you. Rural people have more of a interconnectedness than urban people. And so what it in one sense creates is now there is a harsh, cruel, nameless urban environment that cannot sustain these numbers of individuals. And they do not have the sort of natural, familial, and rural support structure that was offered to them. And what does that create? Despair, hopelessness. And this particular situation becomes an opportunity where it's mixed with the downgrade of Protestant churches in the northern cities. And so, what do evangelical Christians do in this situation? They create new ways to try to serve this new demand, this new opportunity for the gospel. This was taking place in Britain because the Industrial Revolution, in one sense, really got started in Britain, but it was simultaneously taking place in the particularly the cities in the north. And so the YMCA and the YWCA were created at this time to minister to the men and to the women who were coming into these urban cities, to be able to give attention to their soul and to their body. Likewise, the Salvation Army was created at this point. This was created in England by William Booth and his wife Catherine Munford, which I learned this, both of which were preachers. And so they had a commitment that the sexes in the Church of the Salvation Army would be equal, but they aimed to minister to the body and soul of the urban worker. One such individual, and we're gonna end with what comes. D.L. Moody is a shoe salesman in Chicago. What do salesmen need to know how to do? John, you're entering into sales. What does salesmen need to be able to do?
Sell, persuade.
All right. What's a key feature of being able to persuade someone that you're selling what they need? You have to be able to communicate effectively to your potential buyer, but you got to be able to realize, like, what do you need to convince them that they need? D.L. Moody is a salesman. He's not a theologian. D.L. Moody is working with the YMCA. D.L. Moody is concerned about the spiritual need of all these individuals who are coming into the city. He's able to see the kind of destruction, in one sense, that they're bringing to their life. And so while he's in England, he's encouraged to preach. And so D.L. Moody, serving with the YMCA, begins to preach. And he preaches he's got an emotional delivery that communicates in an effective way to these individuals. And D.L. Moody returns and eventually comes to see that he starts a church and an outreach. Right? What takes place, in one sense, D.L. Moody, who's a Christian? I'm not calling into question D.L. Moody's commitment to Christ, his commitment to biblical evangelism as he understood it. Right? But what takes place at this particular time, and I want you to see, it's when there is a downgrade in the local church, and the local church's theology and understanding of the gospel and its ministry. And then there is met with this great need in the cities where people are pouring into them, and they do have real need, that you do find what the evangelical church is going to do. It's going to create an effective way of communication, but it lacks the biblical theological anchor that it used to have. In one sense, it's a similar iteration of what took place in the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening. That the effective communication becomes chief. The ability to create a response becomes the measuring rod for the ministry and the minister, as opposed to the ability to communicate what is true according to God's word, especially in the context of the church. And so D.L. Moody takes the parachurch opportunities of the YMCA, just like the salvation also in one sense begins to modify what the church does, in one sense to try to meet a need, but they also begin to loosen the moorings that were committed to the ministry of the local church as taught in Scripture. Another individual that arises at this time is Billy Sunday. Who has heard of Billy Sunday? All right. He says great things like, Billy, you're rubbing the cat the wrong way. Well, then turn the cat around. All right. He was a baseball player. He spoke in a way that was very persuasive for this, in one sense, new audience. And what is taking place is that, again, you see the downgrade in the churches. Even the Presbyterian church that was marked by the highest educational, theological standard for its minister, they ordained Billy Sunday with no seminary degree because of his effective manner to communicate. We're going to see, and this is, I'll try to end here, that there is the emergence of new denominations at this time. Likewise, the downgrade that's been taking place in the Methodist Church in America, there are Methodists that are rightly discontent for the wanderings, the theological and biblical spiritual wanderings of the Methodist Church from its origins. It's distanced itself from the interest of the Wesleys. And so in the early 20th century, you see this emergence of the holiness movement. The holiness movement has two distinctive points that you need to understand. Number one is their doctrine of sanctification, and number two is their doctrine of the ministry of the Holy Spirit. The holiness movement, in one sense, was born out of this desire to see this commitment to the individual's sanctification to be of an emphasis, a concern. Again, what's taking place in society? You see this downgrade in the churches, the position of the churches, the situations of the city. Men and women are disconnected from their former way of life. There's a lack of the kind of support system of a family. Drunkenness is now on the rise, right? So there's all these problems, and so the holiness movement comes in one sense with this emphasis on sanctification. But they do it by having an understanding that the Spirit of God is going to break in and create these sort of instantaneous advances of one's sanctification that does not come through the intellect, that does not come through informing the mind and engaging the will. And so this is where we have, you may know of holiness churches, right? You may see a number of them. They may be called Free Will Holiness Baptist churches. They may be Pentecostal holiness churches, all right? All of those emerge from the Methodist tradition. The one that grew to the greatest number is the Church of the Nazarene. All right, this is where they come from. But what they believed that was distinctive is that the Christian is not going to grow in his or her likeness to Christ by putting off sin and putting on obedience, but rather through an experience with the Spirit. And that became especially associated with gatherings where these gifts that they see in the book of Acts, speaking in tongues, words of knowledge, prophecy, healings would take place. And it's at this time that we see the birth, or at least the first wave, as people say, of the charismatic movement. It's with Pentecostal holiness. Well, all that's taking place, and we'll end right there. That is as we're coming to the first decade in the 20th century, right? Coming into 1910. I'll set this up, and we're going to look at what I think is the most significant struggle that now emerges, and that's going to be between Christianity and liberalism. And we'll look at J. Gresham Machen and the struggle within the Presbyterian Church at the time. So we covered a lot of ground, and I painted with broad brushes. Any questions? Okay. Y'all are dismissed.